The views expressed are solely those of the speaker and not necessarily those of Paltalk.com, AVM Software, or its advertisers.
News Talk is online. News Talk Online is a production of Paltalk.com, the largest multimedia interactive program on the internet with more than 4 million unique users, on demand on iTunes and on YouTube, and on my blog, GaryBaumgarten.com, where you are encouraged to post your comments, whether you agree with yours truly or not. And thanks to our good friends at CRN Digital Talk Radio. We're syndicated to an additional 12 million households. I am your host, Gary Baumgarten. Welcome to the show. Well, it's less than a week when Barack Obama will be sworn in as President of the United States, and he promised that once he becomes president, one of the first things he will do would be to begin the process of closing Guantanamo Bay detention facility. But will he be able to do that, and will he be able to do it very quickly? And if he does, what do we do with the detainees in there? How do we determine who is really a suspect of terrorism and who is improperly being detained? How do we ensure due process for those individuals? How do we pull back the curtain of secrecy so that the American people and the world can see exactly what's going on with this process? And perhaps more globally, both figuratively and literally, what do we do about those who are being held in other countries, maybe not directly under the control of the United States government, but on the behest of the United States government? Well, one gentleman who has been at the forefront of exposing this, he's been beating this drum for years now, is our guest today, David Swanson. He's a very well-known blogger. He is active in human rights issues. He has been encouraging the government to, among other things, close Guantanamo Bay detention facility. And we're so happy to have you. Welcome, David Swanson, to News Talk Online on Paltalk.com.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Well, it's good to have you here. So I am really confused reading, and obviously if you read the advocacy press or the blogs, you hear contradictory statements about what's really going on with the incoming Obama administration with regard to Gitmo. But I'm even seeing in the mainstream press stories which say he's going to close it, that he backed down on talking about closing it, and then he backed down on talking about prosecuting anybody who may have abused any of the prisoners there. And now he's talking about closing it, but I think the very last statement I heard from him was that it would not be an easy process. It would be a long-term process. And let me just suggest to you, David Swanson, and I would like your reaction to this. You know, it's easy to get into a war. It's more difficult to get out of one, as we're finding out with Iraq. Maybe it's easier to open a facility like Guantanamo Bay, but more difficult to extricate yourself from it. What do you think?
I don't know that I would say that without some qualifications as to what's easy and what's hard about it. I mean, certainly had you tried to open Guantanamo legally, it would have been very, very hard. But being willing to throw laws out the window, perhaps you could call it easy. Here we are in a situation where the crimes have been exposed, and we're trying to close it in a legal and responsible way. And so perhaps that is harder, but it's not nearly as hard as we're being led to believe. It shouldn't take nearly as long as the president-elect is suggesting, and I think we ought to get our priorities straight. I mean, it seems pretty clear now that what's going to happen, unless something changes, is that Barack Obama will become president and almost immediately order the closure of Guantanamo, and yet keep it open for perhaps longer than a year, perhaps significantly longer than that, while working on the process of closing it, which sounds like a contradiction until you realize that what people say in Washington often is very different from what it actually means. So Guantanamo will be quote-unquote closed, but it won't actually close for quite some time unless we can up the pressure to make that happen. And then the question of prosecuting the people responsible is a whole other battle, which will be very much uphill, but very much possible. And as more is exposed, it will become ever more possible.
Well, I'm looking right now at a piece, an essay actually, that was written, first-hand account, and I'm sure you've read it, but I want to share portions of it with the audience before we go further with this discussion to try to set the scene, by Daryl Vandevelde. Daryl Vandevelde, from June of '07 through September of '08, was a prosecutor for the Office of Military Commissions at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And he writes this in the Washington Post, and I am excerpting, but it's all there for you to see online if you want to read it in greater context. One of the detainees I was prosecuting, a young Afghan named Mohammed Jawad, told the court that he was only 16 at the time of his arrest and that he had been subject to horrible abuse. My experience with the Jawad case led me to file a declaration in federal court this week stating that it is impossible to prepare a fair prosecution against detainees at Guantanamo Bay. I had concluded that the system of handling evidence is a haphazard farce. While in U.S. custody in Afghanistan, Jawad had been hooded, slapped repeatedly across the face, and then thrown down at least one flight of stairs. Once at Guantanamo, he was subjected to a sleep deprivation regime during which he was moved to different cells 112 times over a 14-day period. I learned of evidence from field reports suggesting that he was innocent. I tried to negotiate an agreement to have Jawad rehabilitated and sent back to Afghanistan where he could be reunited with his family, but the chief prosecutor dismissed that out of hand. Now, this is anecdotal, talking about just one case, but David Swanson, I presume you are aware or at least suspect that this is not necessarily an unusual circumstance at Guantanamo.
Well, that's not by any means outside the norm of what we've seen in dozens and dozens of examples from first-hand witnesses, self accounts, and